The Long Road by Wolfland. No! No! Something wasn't right. She looked to be in physical pain. Hesitantly, Steven stepped to the front of his trainer's box and peered through the darkness. Wait, why was it so dark? The overhead lights were still on, but it was suddenly so much harder to see the far side of the chamber. He called out to the elite with a nervous glance around. Phoebe? Just as her name left his lips, a howling gust of wind suddenly whipped through the arena, and Steven was forced to shield his eyes from the vicious gale. Peeking out from behind his arm, Steven's eyes went wide. The wind was swirling around Phoebe, trapping her within the vortex. But it wasn't just the wind that was circling. The air had become laced with inky shadows, and the darkness grew heavier by the second. Phoebe still was hunched over, head in her hands, but now her fingers dug into her skin, eyes wide and staring. No, 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 no! She fairly screamed the last word, and Steven watched as Phoebe jerked back, face upturned to the dark ceiling above. All at once, the wind exploded outward, sending him stumbling back from the force. And just like that, the vortex was gone, and an eerie silence hung heavy in the chamber. Then, slowly, lifelessly, Phoebe began to move, producing 2 Pokeballs from beneath her sarong. But she didn't recall her fallen Pokemon. Instead, both Pokeballs fell from her limp grasp with a clatter, and she slumped forward like a marionette that had lost its strings. They each bounced once, and then lay still. Phoebe? Steven's voice came out gravelly, his throat dry. Suddenly, both balls sprang open without warning, but nothing emerged. Squinting, Steven peered through the darkness. Something was pouring out of the open balls. A black puddle of ooze formed at Phoebe's feet, slowly growing until, in a blink, it vanished, seemingly sucked into the floor of the arena itself. What? Were those her Pokemon? Did she just send 2 out against him at once? Steven quickly turned to the scoreboard, but sure enough, only 1 icon was illuminated under Phoebe's name. But there were 2 empty Pokeballs right there on the ground, and her fallen Dusclops was now nowhere to be seen. What on earth was happening? Steven was jolted from his thoughts as Aggron roared in pain. In an instant, his partner had been encircled in a ring of floating purple flame. The otherworldly firelight danced and flickered as Aggron squirmed with discomfort, accentuating the black scorch marks that covered its forelegs and tail. For when it had swiped at the flames to extinguish them, instead of vanishing, they clung to its hide, inflicting a nasty burn. As both trainer and Pokemon scrambled to find a way out of the sudden predicament, they both froze as a cackling laugh rose from the elite side of the field. Just beyond the flames, Steven could make out Phoebe's slumped form from where she had sunk to the ground in a kneel. Her head was bowed, seemingly lifeless. Then who had... 2 fuchsia eyes snapped open in the dusk and slowly rose from the ground until they stood in front of the fallen elite, the creature's silhouette completely blocking Phoebe from view. The haunting laugh drifted over the battlefield once again, and this time, Steven saw the golden glint of a Bennet's Cheshire smile, and he tensed with a scowl. Clearly, the battle was still ongoing, despite the unnerving turn of events. Was this all some kind of trick, meant to scare him into losing his composure? Aggron picked up on his trainer's demeanor and grunted through the pain to affix the Bennett with a glare of his own. But just as Steven steeled himself for the continuation of the match versus the trainerless Pokemon, Bennett twitched into action. Even though the hissing screech was muffled by the zipper binding its mouth shut, the force of its cry caused Steven to wince and cover his ears. Its pupils dilated until the pink was erased by black, and with a shudder, a swath of darkness seeped from deep within its body, curling and writhing across the arena floor in a mass of black tendrils. The first of Bennett's tendrils reached through the flames and lashed itself around Agron's leg, and the massive steel type jerked back in surprise, but the tendril held strong, and soon a second tendril joined it, anchoring itself to a foreleg, and a third wrapping around Agron's tail. Another roar of pain sounded as Agron reared back, trying to free itself, but the shadows would not be thwarted. With a mighty tug, the shadows contracted and dragged Agron straight toward Bennett, where it was sucked into a wall of darkness. Stephen was left staring at his empty half of the battlefield, the only side of the chamber still illuminated by the arena lights. Long drag marks pointed to where Agron had vanished into the empty void of nothingness. Heart hammering in his chest, he tried to shout to his Pokemon, but it felt as if one of Bennett's tendrils had encircled his own neck. He coughed as he tugged at the now suffocating pressure of his dress shirt's collar. And then, just as suddenly as the darkness had approached, it retreated, sucking back to a puddle at Bennet's feet and leaving behind its victim. Agron lay in a heap on the ground, unmoving. The red light of Agron's recall beam flickering in the metal of its zipper, Bennett's neon eyes slowly slid upward until they looked onto Stephen's own. Frozen from where he had begun to reattach Agron's ball to his belt, a vivid image flashed across Stephen's vision. Bennett appeared mere inches from his nose, eyes alight with a hungry glow, zippered mouth cracking open in a wicked grin. Stephen flinched back in surprise, and as Agron's ball clattered to the ground where he dropped it, he blinked in confusion. Bennett hadn't moved from its spot on the battlefield, but Stephen swore he felt the hiss of its breath on his face. Rattled, he quickly retrieved his Pokeball and selected another from his hip. Perhaps Skarmory could continue its dominance over the familiar ghost type. Thankfully, when it emerged, Skarmory showed no sign of the curse's affliction, and Stephen drew in a steadying breath as his flyer gave a sharp caw at the sight of its next opponent. "Just like last time, Skarmory." His words felt hollow, considering what he'd just witnessed, but he couldn't let his confidence falter now. "Just be sure to stay out of the shadows." Nodding, Skarmory caught on to Stephen's cautionary tone, and rather than rushing in, it drew itself up and eyed Bennett with a wary look, waiting. The ghost still hadn't moved, frozen like an eerie statue. Stephen tensed, waiting another moment to see if Bennett would go on the offensive. But when nothing happened, save for the slight clatter of Skarmory's ruffling feathers, he threw his hand forward with a shout. "Air Slash! Now!" In a flash, Skarmory wound up and unleashed two gleaming blades of air, straight for Bennett with a shriek. The ghost watched until the attack was nearly upon it, and just as the blades were about to strike, it slipped into the pool of shadows at its feet as if they were made of water. The attack sent dust and dirt flying as it collided with the arena floor, and once again, the shadows were spurred into action. They began to pour forth from where Bennett vanished, coating the ground in a slick layer of inky darkness. With a squawk, Skarmory backpedaled away from the growing darkness, talons scrabbling as it retreated. Again, the tightness found its way back to Stephen's throat as he watched, and it took considerable effort to shout to his partner, "Up, Skarmory! Get off the ground!" With a push of its wings, Skarmory lifted off just as the spot it was standing on was engulfed in shadow. Circling high overhead, it scanned the battlefield with a warble. There was no ground left to see. Nothing but a sea of black remained, and within it, Bennett could have been hiding anywhere. But so long as Skarmory remained airborne, it would be out of any immediate danger from the ghost's shadowy reach. Except that as the tightness seemed to spread across Steven's chest, Skarmory let out a cry. It had spotted something moving within the darkness. 2 pinpricks of light bobbed in the inky pool of the battlefield, and before Steven could caution his partner to keep its distance, Skarmory curled into a dive, ready to close the distance for an attack. The glowing eyes must have noticed that they had been spotted, and as Skarmory bore down, they began to skitter left and right, running from the steel type's pursuit. Skarmory screeched as it swooped close, setting its wings alight with a steel wing's glow. But as it prepared to strike, the eyes suddenly stopped moving, and the shadows around them sprang to life, bubbling up from the arena floor. With a vicious glint, the eyes leapt up to face Skarmory's charge, sharp teeth bared in a wicked grin. Skarmory squawked as it tried to pull up to avoid the shadowy foe, but it was too late. Its momentum carried it straight into the Sableye fist. The follow-through of the Dark-type Sucker Punch sent Skarmory careening to the ground, where it landed in a heap.